we had a really great kickoff with Dana Penrice of the Young Agrarians. She walked us through an exercise that really helped us think about the land. It felt really like a really important thing to do as a way to kind of not lose sight of our connection, especially as we meet online like this. So it was nice to have her walk us through that exercise. And Dana also invited us to think and to learn more about the treaty lands that we are on. So, for example, I am in Maskwaci-Waskahegan, the city of Edmonton, which is on Treaty 6 land. It's currently my home, but it has been the home to many others, and it's home to many now and also throughout time. So, including the Cree, Blackfoot, the Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, the Dene, Ojibwe Saulteaux, and Anishinaabe, Inuit, and also many others. So thank you, Dana, for walking us through that and reconnecting us. So now it is my pleasure to introduce all of you to our first keynote speaker of today. I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Melissa Arcand. She is a soil biogeochemist from the University of Saskatchewan. Today, Dr. Arcand will be talking to us about her project, Miyo, mawi, Atoskewin, working together to cultivate soil health on First Nations agricultural lands. And I know that if we were in person, if we were having our conference in person, one of the things that we would have liked to have done is to offer Melissa some tobacco and also a gift for the knowledge and information and stories that you're about to share with us. So unfortunately, we can't do that in person this year, but we'll be able to send you something later. So with that, I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks, Iris. Thanks for that introduction. And let me just orient myself to sharing my screen, and then I'll officially get started here. But you can hear me okay, and that's all.
Yeah, we can hear you and see you. Yeah, okay. And I'll just hang out on here until you get that shared.
Sure. Thank you.
And then I'll hop off.
All right. So, all good so far? All right, so yes. Great, thank you, Iris. So I can't see the chat, but if anything really, a burning question comes up, Iris can interrupt me and we can address the question as we go, or we'll just wait until the end of my presentation to have a conversation with all of you. So really thankful to be here. I wish we were all in person, but as Iris said, this is the next best thing. And really appreciative of the invitation to be able to come speak to all of you. I'm really happy to hear that there was some good conversation yesterday, I suppose, around land and relationships to the land, and that's really what I'm going to be talking about today. But before I jump in. I am coming from Saskatoon, and this is my home, and I work at the University of Saskatchewan, and we're here also on Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis. So I'm really thankful to be sort of joining other Treaty 6 citizens, but also others elsewhere and other territories as well. So yeah, very happy to be here and to share some of the work that I've been doing. What I'm going to be presenting on today is, although, really talking about some of the work that I do, I am a professor in the Department of Soil Science. I do have a PhD in soil science, and my research is grounded in soils. But today isn't going to be a research talk per se. It's going to be, I guess, a story of history of the prairie landscapes and how that history has intersected with soil, and also how that intersection between the Indigenous peoples and settling of the prairies through through European settlement has kind of led us to where we are today, and how we think about soil and where we might think about soil in the future. So more of a story and a history talk than one of my classical soil research talks. But I wanted to start by sharing this quote. This is from author Thomas King and his book, The Inconvenient Indian. And he says in this book, land has always been a defining element of Aboriginal culture. Land contains the languages, the stories, and the history of a people. It provides water, air, shelter, and food. Land participates in ceremonies and the songs, and land is home, not in an abstract way. And I really love this quote because it not only tells us of the importance of the relationship to the land, but that relationship is not only material, it's also spiritual and is inherent in the connection among people, but among all of the other living and non-living beings that are in our environments, in our ecosystems and landscapes. And what's in the context of agriculture, which is why we're all here today and over the course of the few days of this conference, I really like to, I guess, make the emphasis that Indigenous people in the plains, in the prairies, did have very intentional relationships with the vegetation, with the animals, with the grazers, and amongst themselves as well. And that interrelationships among all of us really contributed to the shaping of these landscapes, the distribution of the vegetation, and of course, as a soil scientist, the distribution of the soils that we have here across the plains, across the prairies. And the other thing that I really want to emphasize is that there is an intentionality in terms of the Indigenous people's interactions with these landscapes. So really, there was a management system that was occurring on the plains, even if it wasn't, cultivating crops in rows and in intercrops even, but that there was an intentionality to this landscape, and a management system that I think we can, especially in the context of organic agriculture and other ecological approaches to agriculture, a system that really mimics and relies on those relationships, those ecological relationships. So I think that philosophy is grounded in this land that we currently reside on. And of course, as a soil scientist, again, I really like to, I guess, acknowledge the importance that the interactions between the grasslands, the bison, the way that humans had interacted with the animals through prescribed burning, through fire, that ultimately resulted in the really rich, high organic matter, fertile soils, the chernozums that span across the plains. And that this enriched, these soils have really basically been the foundation to the agricultural industry over the last, over a century. But what's often not talked about, or what we don't really know about in good detail, is how the benefits of that agricultural industry and all of the agricultural activities that have happened on these landscapes, the benefits have not been distributed equitably. And so what I'm going to go through probably the next 10, 20 minutes or so is a history about how Indigenous people fit into the story of prairie agriculture, and go through some of the points within time that have contributed to where we are today, and then follow up by talking a little bit more about what is the sort of present day status of agriculture, and specifically I'm talking about First Nations, within First Nations communities in the prairies. And most of my work happens within Saskatchewan, but there's a lot of parallels between what's occurred in Saskatchewan as well as Manitoba and Alberta. So where do Indigenous people fit in the story of prairie agriculture? It's not a story that many people are familiar with, so I'm kind of happy to share some of this history briefly. So something that I want to make note of is, again, Indigenous people within the prairies prior to European settlement were completely conscious of agricultural systems. There were very large agricultural economies in North America and Turtle Island, and there was major trade networks that were occurring. There's evidence of maize seed being found in archaeological sites, even here as north of Saskatoon. So there was an awareness of plants being cultivated and being selectively bred, and all of these sort of features of what we'd consider European style agriculture, but but developed and evolved within context of Indigenous cultures here. So there was an awareness of agriculture, even if individuals or communities within the more northern plains weren't necessarily practicing it themselves. But nevertheless, even prior to signing of the treaties, so Treaty 6, where I am, where some of you are in Alberta, Treaty 6 was signed in 1876. And even prior to signing of the treaties, some of the land had already been broken for agriculture, and some Indigenous people had already taken up European-style agriculture. So even in the 1870s, agriculture was being practiced by Indigenous people in that European style. But of course, with the decline in the buffalo populations, with the declining of our food source, Indigenous leaders who were negotiating the treaties were understanding and aware and conscious of the need to adapt to the changing ecology, to the changing economy of the plains. And so agriculture is actually really central to the treaties that were signed, the numbered treaties that span much of sort of central and Western Canada. And so in Treaty 6, for example, was really focused in on grain farming. So Indigenous leaders who negotiated the treaties really fought hard for various agricultural provisions, including farm assistance, training, tools, seed, livestock, as well as reserve land that could be set aside for farming. In Treaty 7, which is predominantly in the southern portion of Alberta, there was a much greater emphasis on ranching. But nevertheless, these were parts of the treaty that were negotiated, that were brought forward by the Indigenous leaders who fought for more than what was originally offered up by the Crown. And over the years, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, Indigenous people were rather successful at participating in the agricultural economy of the prairies. And there's lots of historical documentation of this. There's yield records that show that they were often outcompeting their non-Indigenous counterparts. And so lots of its success was occurring here. Some of that success is attributed to a couple of factors. One, of course, is that there was a deep understanding of the ecology of these landscapes. There was knowledge of the drought cycles, for example. There was just a better awareness of the landscape and the environments that farming was taking place within. So there's that component. And there's also an acknowledgement of more of a communal approach to farming beyond just either nuclear or extended family lines, but more of a communal approach to farming. And so in the early days of agriculture, it was really practiced in Indigenous people's own terms. It was practiced within the context of their own language, within the context of their own ecological knowledge that had been shaped for millennia prior to actually breaking any prairie to do agriculture. And so there is a lot of autonomy within that growth and development. But unfortunately, that trajectory that was initially one of autonomy was severely disrupted and was disrupted through a number of government-driven actions and official policy, official legislation that sought to undermine Indigenous farmers. And these policies started coming into play to various degrees in the early 1900s. There's lots of really good historical scholarship around this, and so I'm just putting some examples of some of the good books and as well as a really great documentary. But for example, the peasant farm policy prohibited Indigenous people from purchasing and therefore then using what for the day would have been modern farm equipment. And this would have been, for example, even for individuals and communities that may had been using the latest technology in farming, they wouldn't be able to purchase new equipment, and they wouldn't be able to purchase the tools to fix or the parts to fix old equipment equipment. So that really hampered people's ability to move forward and to compete in the larger agricultural market. There were also what are called the pass and permit systems, which restricted both movement of people and also ability to sell their goods, their produce. So the pass system prevented movement of individuals off the reserve and without the written signed pass to be able to leave the reserve that would be signed by an Indian agent. Similarly, the permit system required that any First Nations farmer who wanted to sell their produce, whether it be hay or a few pigs or cattle or grain, they would need to have a permit also signed by an Indian agent to allow them to go to do that. So both of these pass and permit systems really controlled movement and controlled participation in the broader economy. And hopefully the majority of people who are listening to this talk also have some understanding of the devastating impacts that residential and industrial schools had on severing ties between children, Indigenous children, and their culture, language, and also a deep connection to the land that they would have otherwise learned about and grown up with had they been able to stay within their families, within their communities. So there's a number of devastating policies that really sought to undermine Indigenous participation in agriculture. So not only were there these policies that affected people, but there was also policies that affected the land base itself. So within the treaties themselves, I have an excerpt here from Treaty 6, and this is in regards to reserve lands. And so what it says directly in the written text is that Her Majesty the Queen hereby agrees and undertakes to lay aside reserves for farming land, due respect being had to lands at present cultivated by the said Indians. And there's two kind of things of importance within this really short quote. One is it says due respect being had to lands at present cultivated, which implies that there were people who were actually participating and engaging in agriculture at that time, the time of treaty signing. The other important thing that's in this quote is that the reserve lands were set aside for farming lands. So not for, locations where Indigenous people were meant to live only, but where they were meant to farm. And actually, some more recent historical scholarship that have taken into eyewitness accounts of people who were present at treaty negotiations indicates that there was no actual land surrender clause in these treaties, the treaties that span are where we're all potentially residing now. And so what actually kind of played out in terms of land and reserve land? So here's, a great old Google Earth image from not too long ago of Saskatchewan and Alberta. And I'm just going to bring up, I want you all to focus sort of in on the prairies, in on the agricultural region. And even from this aerial photograph, it might be hard to see, but there's little pockets of green that are spread throughout the prairies. And it's in those pockets of green that our present day reserve boundaries are located. And, there's a couple of reasons for this. Number one, much of the land that we now have in present day reserve tends to be marginal land. I mean, not all of it. There's some really productive agricultural lands within reserve lands boundaries, but there's also a lot of marginal land. And there's also, because of the undermining of Indigenous farmers, there was a lot of farmers who got out of farming. They just couldn't make a go of it with all of the barriers and restrictions. And so we end up having these pockets of basically natural lands that are concentrated within these First Nations communities, scattered across the prairies. But what I want to make note here is that these little postage stamps that are scattered across the prairies were not actually the same size of land that were originally surveyed when the treaties were signed. So oftentimes the surveyed lands were much smaller than what was negotiated in treaty, and this has this has resulted in modern day treaty land entitlement claims, and as well, in addition to lands not being surveyed to the aerial extent that they should have been, after lands were surveyed, some of these lands were actually surrendered back to the Crown through sale after the fact. And what this ultimately did is it shrunk our land base. It shrunk where we were actually able to participate in agriculture. And because our movements were restricted and our ability to sell our produce was restricted, we really were sort of trapped within the bounds of these small parcels of land. So I just want to talk briefly about this idea of land surrenders. So this is how our original land that was surveyed, how it got diminished in size. So there's a couple of reasons for this that were initiated by the Canadian government, by the Crown. One was for railway expansion, and another was through what's called soldier settlement surrenders. And this is where the government, after veterans were returning from World War I, but this extended into World War II, those veterans who were returning received land, farmland, so that they could create a new life after the war. And from the Indigenous perspective, the way that the government pitched this to them was that if you sell some of your land, you can use that money then to go and purchase farm equipment and supplies. But remember, there's a lot of control around what can be purchased and what can be purchased, what can be accessed. And so through these through these surrenders, almost 300,000 acres were surrendered in Saskatchewan and over 200,000 in both Treaty 6 and 7 territories in Alberta. And some of these surrenders were done under quite shady conditions, and there's been legal fights that have shown this, that have argued this successfully in the courts. And so some First Nations have actually been successful in specific claims around these surrenders. So I'm going through, a lot of history here, but I'm going to infuse soil back into the conversation a little bit too, and just by providing an example. So what I'm showing here is again just an aerial image, and the red are boundaries of 2 First Nations in Saskatchewan, and these boundaries represent the boundaries from the 1960s. And just for all of you to know, I'm actually from Muskeg Lake Cree Nation, which is the community, the First Nation that's in the bottom left box here. And so some of this history is just from my own knowledge and my own family and the research that has been coming out of our own specific claims processes. But I want to bring this back to soil. So in the 1960s, the Saskatchewan Institute of Pedology undertook a soil survey of basically all of the First Nations lands that were within the agricultural region. So it amounted to 53 different First Nations. Their soils within the reserve boundaries were surveyed. And of course, this is, a great, rich wealth of information about the soils. And so both communities were surveyed back in the 1960s, and these boundaries on the left-hand side represent the boundaries that were present in the 1960s. But these were actually not the original reserve boundaries. The original reserve boundaries were quite a bit larger. And in fact, Missawasa's First Nation, their lands were surrendered through a soldier settlement that amounted to about 19,000 acres. And for Muskeg Lake, it was about 8,000 acres. Now, I'm hoping anyways, this might be a little bit obvious about where I'm going to go with this, but with the assessment of our soils, and of course with the assessment of soils across the rural municipalities, we have an understanding of what the agricultural land capabilities were of these lands. And so this is a map of the agricultural capability classes. This was determined during the soil survey. And we can see Based on those original, those reserve boundaries in the 1960s, Mistawasis, encompassed a lot of Class 3, a lot of Class 4 land. A lot of this land is farmed. In Muskeg Lake, on the east side of the reserve, we got a really good Class 2 land, and it's more marginal Class 4 land in the northwest corner. Now, let me show you what the original reserve boundaries were before the land surrenders, the soldier settlement surrenders. These were the original reserve boundaries, and you can see the land that was lost through surrender. Most of it was very high quality agricultural land. We basically lost all of our Class 1 land, and Mistawasis lost all of their Class 1 land and a bunch of Class 2 land. And so this is just one example of 2 First Nations, but this was rather widespread across the prairies, the loss of land, and not just any land, the best land. And so with that, it really undermined, for those First Nations farmers that were trying to make a go of it, we continued to lose high quality land that would enable people to really make a life out of farming. And I want to share this. This is actually a personal story. This is an article that was published from the Western Producer in 1965, and it's actually about my mushum, who's my grandfather, my dad's dad. And what it's highlighting here is his role in as a farmer. So I'll just emphasize some things here. So it says, J.T. Arcand is a more sophisticated member of the Muskeg Lake Band because he lived for many years outside. And that's because he was a veteran. He participated as a soldier in World War II. And then it goes on to say, the Indian cannot offer to mortgage the land he farms as security for a loan because he cannot own and get title to reserve land. He can only get a certificate of possession from the band for a farm. Under these circumstances, the Indian is handicapped in obtaining farm credit and has no alternative to getting a small farming operation underway and establishing a reputation for stability the best way he can. This Indian farmer has made steady progress in his farming operations, but his future expansion would appear to depend on his ability to acquire more land. And so what I want to emphasize here is that for First Nations people that are farming within their home communities, within the reserve, we can't use the land as leverage to obtain a bank loan or any kind of loan for that matter. And that's because First Nations land is not owned by the band. It's actually held in title by the Crown, and it can't be used to leverage for anything. And so this is one of the biggest barriers that First Nations farmers face, not just in 1965, but today in 2021. It's the same Indian Act based policy that prohibits leveraging of First Nations land. So this has been a continual problem and barrier for First Nations to engage in agriculture. And so there's obviously my mushum was able to farm, but it was through some very creative processes and building actually good relationships with the local credit union that ultimately sort of enabled him to kickstart and continue on in agriculture. And there's been other ways that that Indigenous people and First Nations people did manage to make a go of farming and continue to this day. But what I guess the point is that there's a lot of barriers. There's been a lot of barriers to participation in agriculture, and that a lot of these barriers persist. Some of these are barriers that are born out of policy, that are still policy in place today. Some of these barriers are born out of now social and cultural barriers because of now decades and century now of these undermining actions that have disconnected First Nations people from farming, and in a way that would have followed that original trajectory prior to the imposition of some of these policies. So there are a lot of barriers that still persist. The financial support is a huge one, but also training programs that are specific to First Nations. And there's there's a lot of programs that exist to help farmers in a variety of ways, even crop insurance, for example. But Indigenous farmers and First Nations farmers do not have the same access to those things, or if they could have the same access, there's often a lack of knowledge. There isn't an extension network that is specific to First Nations farmers, given the unique circumstances that we have. And because of this, there's often greater exposure to financial risk. And just like the overall population, farming population, numbers have declined. There's obviously fewer family farms than there were before, but the decline in First Nations farmers, at least within the prairies, who had been practicing either grain or cattle operations, the declines have been more rapid. And so in Alberta, I think it's 150, actually it might be 160 First Nations farmers in Alberta and 140 in Saskatchewan as of the 2016 census. And probably about 25, 30 years ago, there would have been at least 600 farmers in Saskatchewan. So a few years ago now, myself and a few colleagues who are Indigenous people involved in First Nations agriculture and natural resource management, we hosted a forum on Indigenous agriculture here in Saskatoon. And we had about 80 participants, most of whom were Indigenous people involved in land management or agriculture in one way or another. And we gathered and we shared stories, and we shared, I guess, priorities for where they thought and want to see agriculture go. And one of our participants wrote this quote, and it's I find it pretty powerful. So they say, "Lost generations, 2 to 3, with no connection to land or agricultural lifestyle that will take time, 1 or more generations to revive." And I mean, I think this really speaks to the disconnection that has come into play between First Nations people and our own land because of residential schools, because of all of these other policies that undermined our ability to participate in agriculture and our movement. Even within my mush and my grandfather's time, he had to have a permit to be able to sell his grain. So we're not talking about multiple generations ago. We're talking about 1 or 2 generations. And even my dad, who farmed until about 2016, he farmed for 37 years. He had trouble, especially initiating his operation because of some of these financial barriers. And so, there is a lot of hard truths to talk about with respect to agriculture and how it's impacted not only Indigenous people's participation in the economy in the prairies, but also our land. But at the same time, there's a lot of forward thinking and a lot of looking to the future and what can happen. And a lot of, I guess, like inspiring hope here as well. But one thing I want to emphasize is that, First Nations, and many people don't necessarily understand this, but First Nations are fundamentally tied to agriculture. This is through treaty, through history, through present day activities that are occurring on the traditional territories and within our reserve land bases. And that's because even though some of our land is marginal, we still have a lot of agricultural land, and most of that land is being farmed by non-Indigenous farmers. The other thing that I want to emphasize here that a lot of people over the years realize they don't understand this, is that land tenure on reserve poses a fundamentally distinct challenge for First Nations that would like to farm. And this has to do with the Indian Act, and this has to do with the fact that we can't leverage our land. So that's a key thing. The other key thing that I don't think most people understand is that for most First Nations communities, any land management decisions and processes are tied to the Indian Act, and they're administered through Indigenous Services Canada. Okay, so what's an example that I can give that can clarify what this means? So for example, as I mentioned, most First Nations communities, they rent their land, they lease their land to neighboring farmers. Now, for most communities, the actual administration of the permit is actually administered by Indigenous Services Canada. So a First Nation can't just agree to the lease, the terms of the lease, without permission from ISC. And what that does is it hampers the process. What that does is it hampers the ability of that First Nation community to really bargain in terms of the terms of the lease itself. So that can be, let's say, for example, crop rotation. That could be, you know, implementation of best management practices. Because they have to go through this bureaucratic hoop through Ottawa, essentially, it makes it more difficult for those negotiations to take place because it takes so long. And for a lot of First Nations communities, they rely on the revenue that's generated from these lease agreements, from these permits. And so they're at a disadvantage in terms of being able to really be at a level playing field. So that's like a key thing, is that a lot of land management decisions are actually facilitated through the government. Now, it's not all bad news. As I mentioned before, there's what's called treaty land entitlement. And this basically enables shortfall acres that weren't originally provided in the survey of reserved lands back when the treaties were originally signed. This enables First Nations who had those shortfalls to be able to purchase land. And so there'd be purchases from willing sellers. And so a lot of communities are buying up land, and a lot of the land that is being purchased is agricultural land. So the example that I have up on the slide, this is a Cowessess First Nation. They're in Treaty 4 territory in the southeastern part of Saskatchewan. And all of these little postage stamps above the home reserve is actually land that they purchased through TLE. And they purchased they've purchased land in 27 RMs, and most of it's agricultural land. And now they have about 110,000 acres of land in total. And this is great because it enables, you know, they'll be able to collect rent off of that land. Most of the vast majority of that land is being leased. But they also, because they have more land, they're more concerned about how do we ensure that all of this land is being managed appropriately? How do we ensure that, you know, our soils aren't being degraded, that, you know, that our water isn't being also degraded? There's a lot of concerns here. And this is fairly common among most First Nations communities. For this community that I'm working with as part of one of my research projects, they have really high capacity. They've got a fully staffed lands department with 5 staff, most of whom have some post-secondary training in land management. But for a lot of communities, there might be only one person who is in charge of the whole lands portfolio in terms of management. And so there can be a real capacity issue in ensuring that the lands are being properly managed, and also in liaising with a strong position with the non-Indigenous farmers who are leasing that land. So what's happening is that, you know, we have a lot more agricultural land to manage, but there's fewer farmers. There's fewer people that have the day-to-day understanding of how farm operations work, and that's, you know, grain farming as well as cattle operations. There's been a lot of concerns over this concept of leasing land. Lots of anecdotal evidence, at least, to show that there's concerns about whether or not First Nations have been receiving fair market rates in terms of their rental rates. Also concerns about sustainable agricultural practices, and a lot of worry about adverse effect on soil, water quality, habitat, biodiversity. And so in situations where there may be only one person who's in charge of managing agricultural lands and managing the lease agreements with farmers, if there is low capacity and there's sort of low inequity, what this kind of amounts to is almost modern day land surrenders. So where we're not physically, legally losing land, but we're essentially losing land because the farmer basically holds the upper hand and is able to reap, you know, the large share of the benefit of farming that land. So there's concerns around that as well. But again, it's not all bad news. First Nations are building capacity in land management. and actually exerting greater control over their lands, including provisions within their lease agreements with farmers that require certain best management practices, and that are working towards including some of those things that protect other aspects of that agricultural that our ecosystems, to be able to support those other important things, not just yield. And so a lot of these communities are starting to have departments with trained staff, and that makes a huge difference. There are a few communities, more so in Saskatchewan than in Alberta, that have entered in what's called the First Nations Land Management Framework Agreement, or First Nations Land Management Act. And what this does is it enables these First Nations to draft their own community ratified land codes, which is essentially environmental legislation. And what this does is it takes them out of any of the sections of the Indian Act that pertains to lands. And what this does is it reduces bureaucratic hoops. They no longer have to get permission. They don't have to no longer get their agriculture permits to be signed off by ISC. They can work directly with the farmer. And what that does is it enables them to negotiate quicker and to be able to have a sort of a stronger seat at that negotiation table. And so I'm working with some of these two of these communities now in Saskatchewan, and with an interdisciplinary team. So not just myself, but also Indigenous scholars, language speakers, as well as historians who were working together with the lands departments directly to assess their agricultural lands. And it's a atypical kind of project than what I'm used to, having been trained in very much the science aspect of soil science. This is much more a social science kind of undertaking, and to me it's really exciting. And it's involving a lot of interviews and meetings, identifying priorities for each First Nation and their agricultural lands. And so we don't have a preconceived or a predetermined idea of what we're going to actually try and do and measure. It's an iterative process that involves constant communication with the communities in terms of what they're most interested in. And one of the key things is that they are interested in what are the long-term effects of agricultural leasing on their lands. In one of the communities that I'm working with, there's been a lot of aerial spraying. And so they're really concerned about the impacts of that aerial spraying on the bush and the wetlands and those areas where people might be harvesting traditional medicines or picking berries. But what's really key here is that there's this really strong connection to the interconnectedness of all the different components of these agricultural landscapes, not just the soil in the field, but what about the water? What about the animals? What about all of the other organisms that are within these landscapes? So we've been doing, unfortunately, COVID really hampered our activities last year, but we're kickstarting more activities this coming spring. We're going to be doing lots of soil sampling, vegetative surveys, and these are going to be based on, Western style science measurements. But we're also working, hopefully, well, our plan was to work with the high school to get youth involved in some of our data collection so that they can be exposed to science, to STEM fields. But ultimately, we're also wanting to be able to provide information that's useful for them for land use planning, for data management. All right, I think it's about 10 to 2 o'clock your time. So I only have a few more things to say here. But something that I think is really key and that I think would probably speak to a lot of people who are engaged in organic agriculture and other more ecologically minded approaches to agriculture is this connectedness to the land, this notion of stewardship. And this always is drawn out in any conversation that we have about the land. And so these are some quotes from some of the interviews that have been done as part of the Indigenous Agriculture Forum that we hosted a couple years ago, but as well as conversations and interviews that we've had in the last couple of years with the lands departments and community members within the communities that we're working with. And there's some really powerful statements. They say, if the land is healthy, the people will be healthy. We are part of the land. We are stewards of the land. We're borrowing this land, really, so we need to do the best that we can. The land is everything, our teacher, our mother. And this longer quote here is speaking more towards this idea of not taking the quick fix to a problem and trying to find ecological ways to deal with the problem. This quote is coming directly from somebody who was working to restore grassland so that bison could graze on it. The bison were being returned to this area, and they were in the process of restoring the grassland from what had been cultivated land. And so he says, you know, to maintain our traditional relationships to the land, it means that we can't be using chemicals like Roundup. We can't just be killing indiscriminately just to establish some kind of vegetative cover. And that's a challenge, right? Like that's kind of what the consultants had suggested that they do, but they didn't want to take that approach. They had been listening to the elders who said that they didn't want them to take that approach. And that takes more creativity. And it's a challenge. It's absolutely a challenge. But it's one that they are prioritizing. And so, you know, we're at an organic agriculture conference. One of the things that often comes up as well is how can, you know, organic agriculture, how can farming approaches that take on similar philosophies of organic agriculture be implemented to manage First Nations agricultural lands? How can we participate in this kind of agriculture? And so there's just these notes up here are priorities from that Indigenous Agriculture Forum, and a lot of our participants did highlight organic farming. Also, in addition to organic farming, agriculture practices that sustain the natural land resources, better care of the land, but as well as the importance of traditional food systems and revitalizing traditional food. And I'll go through just 2 more slides here. Something else that's been really important and that has really come out because of COVID, the pandemic, is focusing on food sovereignty. Especially at the early stages of the pandemic, there was a real worry and concern about being isolated. And this has certainly happened in the north more so than in the southern region, but we can't just assume that the food is always going to be there. And one community member said, the pandemic really opened our eyes. If everything shuts down, how are we going to survive? And there's a real push towards food sovereignty initiatives, and this includes community gardens. The image that I have up here is from my home community. A couple of years ago, they basically took over. This had been agricultural field, grain production field, and they converted it into a food forest. And so not only does this address food sovereignty issue, but it's been a real center gathering place for community members. And I just want to end with this quote. This is from a woman who spent a good part of her adult life reclaiming Indigenous food production methods and seed saving. And something that she had to say was that we don't have a choice how we farm, how we interact with the land. And she says decolonization, I think, in general, is about choice. And I think this is really key when we think about farming and activities that can happen within our own land bases, is that at the beginning, when agriculture first kind of hit the prairies in the 1800s, at that time we did have more choice. I mean, it was still responding to, you know, the devastation of the bison and changing in that aspect too, but there was still a lot of choice. And where we're at today is trying to reclaim that choice and trying to farm in ways that are aligning with not only the environment and the ecosystem that supports farming, but also our culture. So I guess with that, I just really want to thank the communities that I've been working with. They've been super generous with their time, and it's really a collaborative effort. It's very as a researcher, it's really nice to be working with directly with with the communities, and then all of my staff and collaborators who've been working on this project. So with that, I guess we only have a few minutes for questions, but I'm going to be in that conversation cafe. I'll be in the conversation cafe later today, I think at 2:40 or 3:45. So So yeah, I guess I'll just finish there, and I'll be happy to take any questions if anyone has any questions. I hope everyone heard me.
Yeah.
Okay.
We definitely heard you. Came
Okay,
through.
good.
And yeah, so you know what? We can actually extend the session a little bit, just so if folks do have questions, please go ahead and type them into the stage. You can have into the stage chat. And then, yeah, Melissa will be taking part of the conversation cafes that will be happening later today at 3:45. But yeah, I really want to thank you for that presentation. What a great presentation. I learned a lot. There's a lot of things in there that I had no idea about regarding the history of the land here. And it was really just interesting to see like how you brought it all together for learning about like history and policy, and then that how it affects people and how it then translates into the effect on the land and on soil.
Thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Yeah, it's fun to talk about.
Yeah. So let's give it a couple, maybe a minute or so in the chat. I think sometimes it takes people a little while to chat to put their questions in, and also we have a 15-second delay,
Right.
so we're also working with that a bit. And I also have a couple of questions.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Maybe while we're waiting, and also another thing that kind of stood out to me, or one of the many things that stood out to me, was just some of when you had those statements there from the folks in the community that you're working with and about their relationship with the land and being stewards. Some of that definitely has a similar vibe to how I would say organic farmers that we've had an opportunity to work with, how they see the land and their relationship. And I know that some of those farmers are joining in today. So yeah, and also the line about the challenge of not using Roundup, like the creativity that people need, that farmers need.
Yeah, exactly. And I think because we're at a point, or we're at least for some communities are at a point where they do have a bit more autonomy, or some of the barriers that have cause them more difficulty to participate in agriculture, is some of those barriers are becoming less severe. I think that's where like there is opportunity if we're starting from scratch anyway. Again, like if we're like agriculture hasn't been practiced in some communities by their own members for 10 or 20 years or more. If we're kind of starting from scratch anyways, why not be as innovative as possible? And I think that's where there's kind of excitement around that. So yeah. Oh, and hi, Andy. You asked if I'm familiar with the concept of two-eyed seeing. Yeah, I am actually. Yeah, I think it's really, I think it's really, really a great metaphor. I think for Western and Indigenous knowledge, and how they can be kind of used hand in hand especially to deal with issues related to the land. I'd actually like to learn more about it. I know about it sort of at a sort of superficial level, and I've done some reading, but yeah, I think it's a really cool concept.
As I haven't heard of that before, two-eyed seeing.
Yeah, it's this kind of concept of two-eyed seeing, so Indigenous worldview and Western worldview, and how they can be kind of worked hand in hand. Joanne has a question. Hi, Joanne. What is a good way for a settler with no obvious entry point to begin working with Indigenous communities on agriculture and land issues? Yeah, that's a hard question. It's because I understand that's coming from, you don't want to impose, I don't have a really good answer other than, I think what's been a real problem with the agricultural sector as a whole and what's happening on Indigenous land is that we've been siloed so much, and partly because like a lot of the work that happens on First Nations has been historically so facilitated, for a nice word, by Indigenous Services Canada. And so oftentimes there's kind of a siloing that happens, but there's also really, really like strong desire from communities to access experts in agriculture. So I guess I don't have a good answer, like what is a good entry point from a settler, but I think if there was better communication in general and Indigenous communities knew that there were people who were willing to share their knowledge, that your door would get knocked down. And it just sadly there isn't like that really obvious connection. I'm just trying to think even like what would be a good, I mean, I have a good entry point because I'm part of these communities and through the teaching that I do. So I have that, I guess, advantage, but there's certainly, I mean, inviting, like, if, you know, conferences that you have, I think if you were to be hosting extension type events, knowledge transfer events, invite the local tribal council. There's tends to be a lands committee or department associated with the tribal council, and they're connected with multiple communities within their council. And so just inviting them to an event and them knowing that these events are occurring is one way to make that happen. But yeah, because I think historically the agriculture sector just hasn't even advertised to First Nations. So I think, yeah, even if it's not tailored to a First Nations audience, just saying, hey, we're doing this thing over here. You know, maybe it might be on invasive weeds, a workshop on managing like noxious weeds in pasture land. That would get people going because that's a problem that they're dealing with. But it's just nobody's really speaking to them. So that might be a good way. Thank you. Okay, just going. Michelle is asking, do you have any names of Indigenous farms in Alberta that have succeeded in accessing land through TLE and are using this land for ag purposes themselves? I don't know if I have. I can't speak specific. I'm not as familiar with Alberta. Saskatchewan's treaty land entitlement process happened before Alberta, so we're a lot further along. I don't want to. I don't want to speak without knowing for sure, but I'm guessing that there probably would be. And again, I don't want to speak because I don't want to say a community's name if it's not true. But I can't imagine that there's not. And the teaching that I do, the program that I teach in for Indigenous land managers, I have a lot of students that come from Alberta, and they do a lot of leasing of agricultural land, and I know some of them are TLE, but I don't want to misspeak in case I get it wrong. Okay, Alexis is asking, I'm not sure if you mentioned this, but I'm wondering what the main intention was behind the government implementing the peasant farm policy, pass and permit system, and all the other barriers. You know, a lot of those historical policies actually were stemming out of control. Like we're stemming out of, I mean, in the 1885, the rebellion was occurring, and this was a Métis-led rebellion, but First Nations were implicated. And so a lot of it was kind of spurred first by control. There's also some pretty damning editorials from that era about First Nations, about Indigenous people doing better in their farming. And so there was just, I mean, honestly, just straight out racism. So wanting to ensure that the European settlers who just left Europe, just left a bad situation, potentially coming to the prairies to have their new start. And if they're not, and they're being outcompeted by the locals, right? So there was that as well. And then one thing just led to another and led to another. So, you know, a lot of these, you know, and even actually the pass and permit system wasn't even a legal policy. It was just an action that the government undertook. It hadn't even been legislated, but it was implemented by the Indian agents and directed by the Department of Indian Affairs.